Great. Let me start with the decarbonization. The decarbonization did not cause the rise of energy prices in the last 6 months. This is caused by not mainly the war in Ukraine, but by the sanctions that were put in response to the war. There is actually no physical shortage of oil and gas. Europe decided not to buy. That's it. Full stop. This was on some strategy that this would bring the Russian economy to its knees. I wrote repeatedly from the beginning that that was foolish. Things don't work that way. And this was not going to succeed. And it hasn't succeeded. So this is an own goal. Sorry. That's not how this is going to be ended, by Europe not buying oil and gas from Russia. Russia has alternatives. It's making a fortune at higher prices. The world is not exactly backing these sanctions. The sanctions are backed by about 15% of the world population. That is the NATO region. The rest of the world shrugs their shoulders. Don't get us involved. Thank you very much. So this is not about decarbonization. This is about a sanctions regime. I would not have followed this route. I would not have recommended that Europe put itself into a recession out of this route. I would have asked the question, is this likely to be effective? The answer is no. I would not have let the people that were so gung-ho about the war shout that down, which they did, and say, if you continue to buy, you're funding the Russian war machine and a lot of other things. Rather, I would have gone to negotiate from even before the start of the war. This is about the United States and Russia not negotiating over NATO enlargement. That's why we have the war this year. And we have the high prices because of sanctions that were put on by us that are not going to change the outcome of this war. So if we have more thought on this, we will do better. The decarbonization agenda is not a 6-month agenda. It is a 30-year agenda. It has to be pursued step by step. The most important 2 things are to build the zero carbon energy system. This is the core, zero carbon power, wind, solar, hydro, in Europe, some nuclear with France, and second, to build an interconnected grid. Because with an intermittent energy system, you need interconnection. And by the way, we need interconnection between the North Sea and the Black Sea. It's interesting, they are what's called a dipole of wind. So when it's windy in one place, it's still in the other. When it's still in the other place, it's windy in the first, and so on. So if you connect the North Sea and the Black Sea, you have nice, smooth wind power. So we want a grid that is interconnected and a lot of investment in zero carbon power. What does zero carbon power do? It propels our vehicles in the future. It, of course, heats and cools our buildings. It is core to electrification of a lot of current dirty industry. And it will be the basis of producing hydrogen, which will be used for ocean transport and for some other heavy industrial processes and metallurgy, especially steel making. So the roadmap technologically is known. You have great companies like Iberdrola and others that know how to do this transformation. And we need investment, not in 6 months and not blaming the war. We need investments over the next 25 or 30 years. Why isn't this happening systematically? Mainly because the fossil fuel industry has always been politically powerful for the last century. And it's been powerful, by the way, since James Watt invented the steam engine. And the hydrocarbon sector, the oil and gas sector, became the most powerful lobby in the world after Churchill decided to shift the British fleet from coal to oil. And that made that sector crucial. And so we have a political challenge. My country is a petrostate, the same way that Russia is a petrostate. The chairman of our Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, buckle your seatbelts, owns 2 coal companies. So what is his mission in life, Senator Joe Manchin? It's to stop all climate legislation. In a sting filming of a lobbyist who thought he was doing a job interview but was actually spilling the beans about how ExxonMobil lobbies, they called Senator Joe Manchin the kingmaker of the Congress, because ExxonMobil could always turn to the kingmaker. Well, this was news for about 10 seconds in America. Why? Because American politics is so corrupt, that doesn't make news. He wasn't asked to step down from the Senate committee. He wasn't asked anything about it. Because if you say there's corruption in America, they say, well, duh. You know, well, what do you think? You got a PhD to know that? So we have a political system that costs about $15 billion per election cycle right now. You think it's the poor people paying for the elections? No. So this is why we don't get consequent action. The US Senate hasn't voted one piece of climate legislation since ratifying the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. Not a single major piece of climate legislation, tiny things, but nothing significant, because the system is so corrupt. And so that's the US. There's Saudi, there's Russia, there's Australia, there is all of the countries that have fossil fuels are crazy. You're just a little crazy because you just have a little bit left. And I mean, it makes it hard politically. If you have a lot, it's almost impossible to think straight. And to show how blind we are, like King Midas, like the myths, here we've discovered some hydrocarbons in the Eastern Mediterranean. First of all, do we need those hydrocarbons? God, no. We have more hydrocarbons than we could ever safely burn. But look who's going crazy over this. Turkey versus Greece versus Cyprus versus Israel versus Egypt. Everybody's scrambling for this new deposit of hydrocarbons that should be left under the sea. Thank you very much. There's no use for it at all. So this is our problem. We don't think straight. We don't plan properly. Our politics are corrupted. That's been a problem. And what we need is a program for the next 25 years, but we should not confuse the war and decarbonization. And we should not blame decarbonization at all for anything that's happening right now. It has nothing to do with anything that's happening right now. Not at all. On the question of deglobalization, there are profoundly deep reasons for globalization. For me, the deepest reason is that I like coffee in the morning, and it does not grow in Central Park, where I live. So I want Guatemalan coffee or Indonesian coffee or Ethiopian coffee in the morning. I really want it. And I can't have it without globalization. And there are about 10 million products like that. And by the way, I like to come visit Madrid. That's globalization. And other people like to come visit as well. And I like other cultures too, because the world, maybe since the Tower of Babel, has had different cultures, different languages, different vantage points in the world. It's a beautiful part of living. I really like Chinese culture, and it goes back 3,000 years, and it's beautiful, and I want to know more about it, and I want to go visit Xi'an, and I want to go visit different places. That's globalization. And I want my students to be from these countries and go home to these countries, and I want to go give guest lectures in these countries, because that's a wonderful part of life. So what are we talking about? Now, that has all been made stronger by technology, because the technology of globalization is transport and communications. That's what connects us. So we now have the most effective transport and communications imaginable in the history of humanity.
Yeah.
And we should be globalizing every moment on Zoom and on connections. And I usually have about 10 different meetings in all different parts of the world on an average day, typical day. So even if I'm sitting in my living room, I'm globalized. And that's another wonderful thing. So I think if we measured that chart, not on physical goods and services, but on bytes or bits that are being transmitted, the globalization's off the charts. And so in this sense, we should be much more globalized and enjoying each other's company and each other's products and each other's specialization and each other's innovation. That's a goal. Now, given that globalization has been part of humanity for a long time, I'll plug my recent book called The Ages of Globalization. I argue that globalization is 70,000 years old in different waves of technology. First, it was walking and rafts, and now it is the digital age. Globalization has had setbacks. The worst setback was from 1918 to 1945. That was a disastrous period of deglobalization. So we saw what happens when nationalism comes to the forefront. You end up with economic collapse first, which was the first wave of that period, and then war, which was the second wave. We actually cannot have another world war. I don't know how, if we're going to avoid it, but we're in a different era from all of human history with the nuclear age. So we can't afford such a blunder again. So we have to think completely differently. And that makes it very hard. And when I read the stupidest thing that I've read in the last 6 months, and I've read it often, don't let Putin blackmail us with nuclear blackmail. Well, sorry, I take the risk seriously, and so should you. It's not about being blackmailed, it's about knowing that we're in a nuclear age and we should behave ourselves. Because it's a different period. And if you study the nuclear age carefully, which I've tried to do for many, many years, you know how close we've come to the brink several times. And I know about my country, we're led by a lot of stupid people very frequently. And if those stupid people had had their way 60 years ago in the Cuban Missile Crisis, rather than John Kennedy, who saved the world almost single-handedly against his advisors, we would have blown up the world, because every one of Kennedy's advisors in the Cuban Missile Crisis said, take out those nukes, because everything they thought they knew about them was false. All CIA intelligence, completely wrong. But Kennedy had the good sense that the world depended on him, and he said, we should be cautious, we should be diplomatic, and we should compromise. And he did. You take out your missiles, we'll take out our missiles. The big problem was that at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he insisted on keeping the trade secret. So Americans learned the lesson, we won, instead of we compromised. Had they known the truth, we might have saved ourselves a lot of grief afterwards. because we completely misread the lesson of that crisis. The lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was compromise. Compromise is not appeasement. Compromise is saving ourselves. And so, bottom line for me, globalization, we need it, we want it. Could it be stopped? Yes, of course it could be stopped, but it would be a disaster.
Very good.